The Avro Lancaster B Mark III carries the biggest bombs in War Thunder. Let's check it out. In the 1930s, the British Air Ministry published a specification for a twin-engined medium bomber. There were several bids, including the Avro Manchester, designed by the famous engineer Sir Roy Chadwick. The Manchester was a fairly modern bomber when it was introduced in 1940, but the Rolls-Royce Vulture engines were problematic and they never really worked out. The plane was redesigned and enlarged to a 4-engine layout using the more reliable Rolls-Royce Merlin. This new bomber showed significantly better performance numbers over the basic Manchester and was renamed the Lancaster, more commonly known simply as the Lanc. The plane went through a relatively brief development period and it entered service in February of 1942, quickly becoming the Royal Air Force's primary strategic bomber. It had a larger bomb load than any other aircraft in the European theater, and slightly modified versions carried the Grand Slam earthquake bombs, which were the largest non-nuclear weapons used during World War II. The real secret to the Lancaster's payload was the layout and design of its bomb bay, which offered much more flexibility than comparable bombers. All of its offensive power came at a cost, though. The Lancaster had notoriously poor defensive gun coverage. The gun turrets were something that really never got sorted out, with some squadrons and even some individual air crews modifying, removing, or upgrading the turrets on their aircraft to try and compensate for the blind spots and the low firepower. Even still, Lancaster air crews had the highest attrition rate of anyone in the UK's armed forces during the war, and while primary sources differ a bit on the exact count, roughly 45% of all Lancasters built were lost in combat or in accidents. Despite this, the Lancaster is generally considered to be an enormous success, serving after the war and forming the basis for several later designs. What we're looking at in War Thunder is the Lancaster B Mark III, which was the main production version of the plane. The Mark I that it's folded under in the tech tree is very similar, and most of the review kind of applies to the Mark I as well. This plane is in rank 3 of the British air tree with a battle rating of 5.3. The plane has a crew of 5, 2 pilots and 3 gunners. The rear gun turret has a pair of 50 cals, while the spine and nose turrets have smaller light machine guns. To be blunt, the gun turrets on the Lancaster are simply inadequate. They have huge blind spots, and even with a max upgraded crew, they often can't track enemy fighters very well, and they have pretty low firepower anyway. The main feature of the plane is, without a doubt, its loadout of dumb bombs. No custom loadouts yet, but you get a pretty wide selection of different configurations and bomb weights. With a mixed bomb load, you can easily carry enough to take out 2 bases in air battles and still have a couple bombs left over. You can also take the 8,000 and 12,000 pound blockbuster bombs individually. These weapons are enormously powerful and can drop a base in one hit, clear a huge number of clustered AI ground units, and they're absolute gold when used in close air support. But more about that later. For now, just know that the 12,000 pound HC Mark I bomb is currently the largest conventional bomb in the game, slightly edging out the Fab 5000 carried on the PE-8. Oh, and they can sink a capital ship in one hit. In terms of flight performance, the Lancaster is a huge 4-engined prop bomber, so maintain realistic expectations. It flies like a bathtub full of cement. It's slow, much slower than basically every fighter in its BR range, and slower than some that are even quite a bit lower in BR, and its rate of climb isn't very good. Both of these numbers are also going to drop off considerably when it's fully loaded up with bombs. Its engines are prone to overheating even without WEP, and like most large bombers, it's got a pretty low rip speed and its structural tolerance is iffy at best. The wings will come off at about 600 kilometers an hour, so be careful when you're diving back down for landing, and if you pass 4Gs for more than like a second or two, the whole plane will basically just fall apart. Its speed maxes out at around 450 kilometers an hour in level flight, and its turn radius is large, so you have to line up attack runs, usually at least a kilometer or two away. Now, there are a couple of high points, though. After you drop your bombs, the performance of the Lancaster improves significantly, and when it's empty, it flies like a bathtub full of less cement, allowing for defensive maneuvers and even better turns and stuff while you're on your way back to the airfield. Second, the Lancaster is surprisingly tough. Believe it or not, this plane can take an absolutely enormous amount of punishment and still keep flying despite all odds. I've had more than a few matches in this plane where I made it back to base with half my damage readout solid black or red. Plus, the self-sealing fuel tanks actually come in handy, considering how often the fuel tanks get hit. So overall, I give the Lancaster surprisingly high marks for survivability. Now, bringing the Lancaster into air battles is relatively typical 4-engine heavy bomber stuff. Expect the usual climb out and drop down gameplay, going back and forth between targets in the airfield. There are some notes though. First, with the insane bomb load in this plane, you can rack up an absolutely enormous amount of mission points, and the Lancaster is just a champion for grinding out some of those in-game events. You can clear out dozens of AI ground units, sink ships, and destroy bases more effectively than basically anything else in the prop tiers. Only the B-29 and Tu-4 come close to the Lancaster's bomb load, and those are up fighting jets. So if you need to do one of those Grind the Stars events or something, consider the Lanc. Also, the Lancaster is much more effective in close air support than a lot of other large prop bombers. The reason, pretty obviously, is the huge blockbuster bombs combined with how tough the plane is. Using the big 12,000 pounders, you can clear out capture points like a champion, or take out clusters of vehicles if you're lucky enough to find some to drop on. Now, if your playstyle is to take more smaller bombs, that's a totally legit option. But the blockbusters are the same spawn points as the other top-end loadouts, so they're actually not that hard to get into. There is one thing I really want to stress though. If you fly out with one of the larger bombs, please, for the love of Sir Roy Chadwick, communicate with your team on the ground, and make sure that they know to clear out of wherever you're about to drop. These things have a lethal blast radius of over 100 meters, and it's really easy for your teammates to get into the kill zone if they don't know what's coming. Oh, and the instant the other team recognizes that you're in a Lancaster, get ready to be a priority target because they probably know what's coming. Visually, the Lancaster's a pretty weird-looking plane. The front end looks like it's got a pretty bad underbite, but the Lanc does get some cool skins available in-game. Personally, the Canadian one is probably my favorite, but they all look decent anyway, so take your pick. Landing the plane can actually be a little difficult. You have to plan your landing runs well in advance, and coming down from high altitude can take a while and be a bit of a chore. The plane has almost no maneuverability when you're at low altitude with the gear and the flaps out, so you're going to have to get lined up with the runway at least a kilometer or two out most of the time, sometimes longer depending on your airspeed. You can safely drop gear and landing flaps just under 300 kilometers an hour, and thankfully the plane has a short landing run with good brakes. But I strongly suggest practicing landing this thing in test flights, since going back and forth between targets and the airbase is like the core of heavy bomber gameplay, and you're going to be doing it a lot. The cockpit is a low-poly, low-res placeholder. Visibility is awful, and the interior is an eyesore. That's really about it. Terrible cockpit for VR flying. To close out on the Avro Lancaster B Mark III. This plane carries the biggest bombs in the game, and it can survive a lot of damage. However, It's a huge 4-engined prop bomber, and it flies like one. Its defensive gun turrets are simply inadequate, with huge blind spots. And it can overheat its engines even just at 100% throttle. The final verdict on the Lancaster is that with the huge blockbuster bombs, this thing is an absolute monster that destroys anything it can find on the ground. The perfect grinder for those semi-annual mission point events. As always, thanks for watching.